I will start now. Let me share it.
Okay, before you share it,
Okay.
I will present the session. Welcome this evening as well to the Edicula series of seminars concerning, in this case, the Holy Aedicule rehabilitation at the Holy Sepulchre as an interdisciplinary example of study and implementation, which was a work that we were the scientific supervisors, and me personally, the chief scientific supervisor. I have the honor to present today in this session my research team, which is presenting right now all the issues of materials investigation concerning non-destructive prospection, concerning characterization, and reverse engineering for the repair mortars, as well as for all the materials and conservation interventions. Of course, as you might understand, 4 years after we accomplished the project and continuing research, elaborating the data and the results we had in hands, we are able to look at our work a little bit beyond the very strict issue of materials and perform through these lectures an approach which is broader. The lectures of today are by Dr. Kyriakos Lampropoulos, the structural evolution of the Holy Aedicule, which is actually prospection of the past. Dr. Kyriakos Lampropoulos is a member of the scientific and lecturing staff at the NTUA at the sector of material science and engineering, and he was responsible for the ground penetrating radar prospection at the Holy Aedicule, among others. Kyriakos, you are having the floor.
Thank you, Professor Moropoulou. Let me see if the sharing. It's full, I think, correct?
Correct.
Okay, perfect. Today we'll be talking about the structural evolution of the Holy Aedicule. It can focus on the ground penetrating radar to understand the structure of this building. It's a continuation of the previous talks, and especially you should see this talk in correlation with Professor Kores and Professor Georgopoulos talks, because in order to understand the building, you need to know its architecture, you need to know its geometry, and now you need to see the materials and the structure itself. But before we see that, we need to understand its past. That's why the title has prospection of the past, although in reality it's non-destructive testing. Previous speakers and Professor Moropoulou has shown that this was an effort that started in 2015, and when we had the diagnostic research project, and then in 2016 and 17, in the matter of 1 year, we managed to have the scientific supervision of the rehabilitation project. Chief scientific supervisor was, of course, Professor Moropoulou, and the NTUA interdisciplinary team was headed by Professor Kores from the School of Architecture, Professor Georgopoulos from the School of Survey, Rural and Geoinformatics Engineering, Professor Moropoulou from School of Chemical Engineering, and Professor Spirakos and Professor Mouzakis from School of Civil Engineering. a brief overview of the main phase of the Aedicule before we end up today, as you can see in the 3D model. It's a long history for almost 2,000 years. It started from an original tomb that was rock cut into the quarry outside the city of Jerusalem. And this was the area where this was the tomb where the Jesus Christ was buried. 100 years later, this tomb was buried itself under the Hadrian's temple. When the Romans came and they wanted to build a new temple over this site. The main change happened when Constantine the Great and Saint Helena revealed the tomb after Saint Helena had she found the cross and built, were actually ended up with an Edicule structure, which is a building protecting and surrounding the burial tomb, the burial site, and of course a whole complex of a church. This was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It took almost 7 centuries before any significant damage occurred to the church, and this was in 1009 when Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim supposedly destroyed the Aedicule, and I'm putting a question mark, and later on Dr. Deleg will explain that we have doubts whether they completely destroyed the Aedicule itself, but we have indications that they did damage both to the Aedicule and of course to the church. In the 11th century, when the Byzantines, they modified the Edicule, we will see some plans and some reconstructions. And again, the Crusaders, they did the same with the Edicule and of course with the whole church, as Professor Kores has shown in the, 2 days ago, and as Professor Moropoulou also with a brief history of the site. Another big change was in 1555 with Father Bonifacio de Ragusa, who supposedly rebuilt the Edicule. He was the last person to open the tomb because we have indications that this was the marble plate over the burial surface is attributed to this era. And then, as we all know, the big fire in 1810 destroyed the rotunda roof and inflicted significant damage to the Edicule, to the extent that Kalfas Komnenos, the Greek architect, reconstructed it significantly. The whole idea is that before we look, nowadays the Edicule is dates 2 centuries ago to the 1810 Edicule. And the problem with the prospection is to understand whether there are any remnants of the previous phases of the Edicule within the current Edicule, and to see how this evolved, both in geometry, in size, and in terms of materials. The problem lies with the site. The site, as you can see in this nice aerial view of 1931, is already too crowded with buildings, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is surrounded by a dense urban matrix of the old Jerusalem, but still it's a dense urban matrix. So how can we deduct from this site what happened 2,000 years ago? Usually we are based on depictions or reconstructions of previous scholars. This is the case, for example, with Bernardino Amico from 1609, where he reconstructed the city of Jerusalem back in the era of Jesus. This was in 35 AD. We can deduct, we can see that the temple is on the east side of the city, as Professor Perez explained, the whole morphology and the whole geomorphology of the site. You can see all these valleys and so on. And on the west side of the city, outside the original walls, you can see the Calvary, the Golgotha, and somewhere here we are supposing that the tomb or the tombs that they were using the quarry as a cemetery were located. We cannot deduct much about distances and form of the site. And again, we have to remember that this was a reconstruction from 1609 of what Amico thought that the city of Jerusalem looked like in the era of Jesus. There is another depiction of the same site. Here it's clear to see that the Golgotha is here, and then they have the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ. And you can see the whole morphology of the old city of Jerusalem with a depiction that Amico, and we were going to see some of his work later on because it's very important, because he depicted the Edicule back in 1609, which means this is a Crusaders' Edicule. But you can see the difficulty in trying to understand the whole site. Obviously, it wasn't such a barren land. I can barely see any trees, but this is supposed to show all the pilgrims how the whole area looked like. Some more recent plans. This is from Di Stefano and Pastorelli. You can see the development of the city of Jerusalem. In the time of Jesus Christ, was the blue wall, the second wall. So Golgotha is located on this corner, and there are some gates going outside the city. And then the city evolved a little bit larger, so it engulfed the Golgotha and the burial site. And of course, later on, it expanded further to the north. The whole idea was that this corner was used to go to other places outside Jerusalem, so this was an entrance. And as it has been said, they were crucifying people in places that they could be easily seen, so that the criminals would not do the same. So outside this city, there was an abandoned quarry. They had a quarry almost from 7 centuries ago. And this was used to get stones to build all the walls of Jerusalem, among other quarries, of course. So this was an area, something like that. The danger with such depictions and such reconstructions is that although they look elaborate, this particular architect is involved in archaeological design, although they're very good in explaining the general public how it looked like, or at least in the era of Christ, they cannot avoid having mistakes. For example, a very prominent mistake here is that we see Golgotha, and then the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, which is supposedly to be the tomb of Christ, is to the east of Golgotha, which is the opposite. It should be somewhere here. So despite his good efforts to have all the details about how the city looked like, we have doubts about how the actual site looked like, because you can see an ancient quarry with some trees, supposed to be the garden, but then the tomb is in the wrong side. The same architect, perhaps that's a little bit better depiction, reconstruction of the city, just to get the whole morphology of the area. You can see the quarry outside the second wall. And but even that, this was corrected by Pastorelli later on to show a better depiction of the actual quarry morphology. And this is where the tomb of Christ was located, and this is Golgotha. So you can get an idea where it was located outside the city, at the crossroads of going out to other areas in Galilee. Here is another impressive reconstruction of the whole of the abandoned quarry at the time of the Golgotha. This was used for National Geographic during their exhibition in Washington. However, we have to be also very careful, and I'm showing these reconstructions in order to understand what we are expecting to see behind the facades of the Edicule. If we cannot understand, if we do not have an idea of how the site looked like, we may be mistaken in interpreting all the non-destructive results. And that's the real danger in most of these techniques. If you don't have some idea of what you are expecting to see, you may not be able to see that. On the other hand, it could be biased by expecting to see something, and then you are going to see it. Anyway, the problem with this kind of depictions of these reconstructions, despite all the artistic beauty they have, is that they have some semantics and some actual morphological problems. First of all, I completely doubt it that having such a large quarry that was supposed to be a garden, although I cannot see any trees or any garden inside this area, in the era of Jesus Christ, that the only one to think that okay, it would be a nice place to cut a tomb in the rock would be Joseph of Arimathea. In this depiction, we only see one tomb, for example. Second, how did they go to this tomb? They climbed all these steps. It's kind of difficult if you think about it. And even if he was a very wealthy man, Joseph of Arimathea, why would he build, a tomb facing Golgotha where they were crucifying people? I would assume that obviously this, yes, it would look something like that, like an abandoned open quarry. And again, if you remember the Professor Torres' presentation, underneath this area, this was an underground quarry. It's the continuation. I will show it in the next plans. So the problem is that if we assume that there's a rock volume above the supposed tomb of Christ, then we are expecting to see this kind of morphology. But in reality, when we actually look at the ground plan and the height level of the rock substrate below the Church of the Holy Aedicule, this is not realistic. For example, in this area where it says quarry, the elevation is not that low. It's actually north to the Latin side. It's almost 30 centimeters below the floor. So this volume should be filled with rock, for example. Even here, this is what Professor Moropoulou showed yesterday. This was a documented cistern, which is the cistern below the courtyard in front of the entrance of the church. This is not the morphology it has. Anyway, to make things even worse, because we assume that this was because we believe that this is the tomb of Christ, we believe that this was very emblematic and very typical of what we expect and what we have heard of these kind of tombs. However, even these kind of reconstructions are problematic in the sense that, okay, first of all, there's only one tomb in this area. Second, yes, there is a rock that supposedly closes and seals the tomb, but as you can see, the door is larger than the tomb, than the rock. Second, you see like a large burial chamber with a very, very wide corridor, and you see a pre-chamber which is not even covered. What I'm trying to say is that in reality, it's probably closer to what Vincent and Abel in 1914 depicted as a typical tomb or as a supposed tomb for Jesus Christ or for the Holy Sepulchre. In that, yes, indeed, there is a pre-chamber. Actually, if you are wondering what this thing is they have this in order to sit around. It's like in this area. It's like for people to go inside the pre-chamber and sit down. And even that, I think it's too excessive a corridor and too excessive a height here, but still it's a better idea of what might look like. In reality, and if we actually look at tombs of that era, if we go and see the Akeldama tomb complex outside in the city of Jerusalem, most of the tombs it's a cluster of underground rooms connected with each other with with an entrance, for example, here, and then you go down one level, you go another down one level. You can see something like 15, 20 tombs here and the same one. So it's a three-dimensional cluster of tombs, which are nothing more than like they do a hole inside in the rock and they put the body there. Of course, there are other tombs like they have a burial surface or they have rock boxes. But all I'm trying to say is that we have to kind of be skeptical about the possibility of having one tomb only in this abandoned quarry or in the garden, and this tomb having only one burial surface for the Joseph of Arimathea and subsequently for Jesus Christ to be buried upon. And we should better approach the whole problem of having probably many more tombs that were later on destroyed or disappeared during the evolution of the whole church complex. That was the idea of showing all these plans. Corbo in the 1980s, Corben was known, and after these were the two major scholars that they looked at the church in the 60s and they cooperated. Corbo has a very nice book and a publication that they have some amazing plans and where everybody's using them, and you have seen most of the plans in many talks about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He noted here, for example, just to realize how difficult it is to see this and then in reality having this kind of plan. For example, this was the southern cistern below the courtyard of the church. This is the Golgotha. This is 4.8 meters above the ground level. They assumed the 0.0 level as the floor of the basilica or the Catholic side. So you can see that even here on the north side of the Edicule, it's only 40 centimeters below zero. So it's here you can see something like a whole area missing. The problem also with this depiction is that, yes, we have some tombs here, the Joseph of Arimathea, but how are they approaching them? Do they approach like this? That's probably one hypothesis. But as I showed you earlier, when you have a cluster of tombs, you can have approach from the top, for example. You go down and you keep going into different rooms, moving further down into the rock. So there is no need actually to have an entrance from the north side of the current position of the Edicule. It could actually be a cluster of tombs entering from the Christian road. The same happens with this area. They are not depicting that. But all I'm trying to say is that if we actually look at the depth of the rock substrate, then you have a better idea of the morphology. And this is what you might be expecting for the abandoned quarry to look like. These arrows, Corbo describes three distinct periods of the quarry, if I remember well. The first period was between the 7th century and the 1st century before Christ, when they were extracting all the stones for the walls. You can actually see two main directions, one north-south, like this, and this is actually where the cistern was. And these are actually rock cut from the rock blocks cut from the rock substrate. And then you have the west-east, east-west. You should realize that this is the area of the chapel of the St. Helena, and this is almost 10 meters below the ground level. So this is an area which is an underground quarry, and they were taking blocks from this area. And then the second phase was when this was abandoned and became a garden. You can see some two distinct levels of, this is about 3 to 4 meters above the ground level, and then you have the road, the Christian Church road, which is almost 10 meters. The problem is okay, do we expect that the 10 meters elevation is almost above the tomb, or it was a 5-meter elevation? If it is a 5-meter elevation, yes, it's in the order of the Golgotha. Also, you can see the Golgotha, the Calvary, that this was gradually, this was in the third period, this completely disappeared, and they left only this small block of unused rock, low-quality rock, that this was the site of the crucifixion. I have tried to overlay Corbo's plan over the Lavas Balodimos plan, just to give you an idea where are these located. So the current Edicule is in the center of the rotunda. You can see the problems where these are the volumes of the rock, supposed rock that they have been removed to create all this complex church. This is the church, the result of many modifications, and this is actually the Crusaders' church. And this gradual area has also disappeared to have all the other buildings to the south of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And then you have, this is the courtyard. You can see that this is almost 8 meters below the ground level in this area, and there are other tombs. They have found it. So things are getting more complicated than we expected at first, and that's the idea of being a critical scientist. Before you start interpreting all the ray diagrams and the thermocameras and all the results you see, you have to look back into the past in whatever documentation, and you should be careful to trust no one, but trust someone also. So it's a combination of critical thinking and logical thinking, I would say. This is from Gibson and Taylor. They are depicting the height levels of the whole area. Again, it's very difficult to realize how it looked like in the era of Jesus Christ. So the problem still persists. In the Hadrian area, the other main problem is, okay, when the Hadrian came and built the temple during the period of Aelia Capitolina, where did they build the temple? And unfortunately, or fortunately for us, I guess, the temple has disappeared. The people have assumed, they have made many hypotheses during the excavations, the archaeological excavations in the 60s with Corben was known. They revealed some of the, or what they assumed to have been parts of the masonry of the temple, but there again we have to be careful of how we interpret these things. These black areas, for example, Corbo believes that these are belong to Temenos. It was not believed otherwise. Could be to the Constantine later on. This is a depiction or reconstruction of the temple according to Corbo, and the main question is, okay, what was the position of the western wall of the temple? The actual temple was built onto a podium. So did they actually fill the whole quarry and reach the Christian Quarter Street? Did they remove any block of rock above the tomb? And the main question, why did they stop on the just before the Holy Row? Here, is it that we were lucky enough as Christians to have the wall of the Hadrian Temple stop just outside the current Holy Aedicule? You can actually see a depiction, for example, from National Geographic and see it looks amazing, it looks very nice, but then you realize, okay, if I were Hadrian, why would I actually try to fill all this open quarry, put something and then put earth and fill up the whole area and not move further to the west? These are the kind of questions we should ask to ourselves when we start being critical and trying to find out where the position of the temple was, or it's better to be based on archaeological data. And archaeological data like this was all the work of Corbo. Corbo, they did this excavation. Remember yesterday when Professor Moropoulou showed you the documentation of this area, underground area. This is not something like it was open during the first Edicule, but they have found remnants of the walls from Hadrian. This is the black line here. So we were like that at least the western wall, this one probably stopped just before the current Edicule. Just to give you an idea how complex this question could be, if you remember yesterday when Professor Corres was talking about we were trying to put a supportive beam, vertical beam at the eastern facade of the Edicule, and we have made a hole and we found the floor level just in front of the Edicule. It's exactly this area. This area, he said that it's almost, I don't know, 1 or 2 meters down. So the morphology in front of the current Edicule is not like flat as the rotunda floor might indicate, but it goes down. Actually, if I remember well, if this is there is a trench going from north to south and going to the underground system at the courtyard of the church. And again, there is also this system. We do not know whether this tunnel that this was documented by National Technical University in 3D actually existed during the Hadrian area, the Jesus Christ era. We do not know yet. Sabelli in 2015 tried to depict some of these overlays. You can understand that The Hadrian Temple stopped almost immediately in front of the tomb of Christ. And you can see the height difference between the Christian quarter and the whole, the current level of the current floor level. And this is the Golgotha. So my main question is why, if he actually made the podium, and if he actually leveled the whole podium to attach the Temple of Aphrodite over the Golgotha, that means that it's probably at this level, why didn't they move further to the west? What stopped them to doing so? Then in the era of Constantine, when Constantine and Saint Helena found, when Saint Helena found the cross, Constantine's architects built this great church complex. Professor Corres yesterday described that. I will go this quickly. There is an eastern atrium, then there's a basilica, and then here is a Golgotha, an enclosed colonnaded atrium, triportico, because it has three colonnaded corridors. Then the circular building, which is Anastasis, and then this is the area of Patriarchate. My question, which regards also about this depiction of the Aedicule, is, okay, if you look at these kind of plans, very detailed plans, and all these black areas represent masonry or foundations excavated by Corbo and his colleagues that they have attributed to the Constantine era. So, for example, inside the chapel of St. Helena, this massive foundation wall has been attributed to Constantine. Indeed, it probably is this wall from a basilica, and again from the atrium. You can see that in the Russian church. I keep forgetting the name. And again, the one this is the north side of the church. This is also attributed to Constantine era. And of course, the lower levels of the rotunda perimeter is attributed is surviving from that era too. My main question is, okay, you are the architect of Constantine the Great. This is the north-south direction. This is the Cardo Maximus. For me, and we keep having this question, is why didn't he make this, for example, orthogonal, the basilica? Why didn't they orient the basilica east-west? Okay, perhaps they didn't want to, fine. But why didn't they, for example, orient this rotunda the same axis of the basilica? It might be actually even more visible in this plan from Quesnel, again in the 1970s. He has a different plan, you see. He has no, like an entrance and a colonnaded entrance in front of the Anastasis. He has a different, he's supposed to have columns in the eastern atrium. These are not easy answers. They are supposed to be interpreting the same data, but they are believing that the plan of the church of the Constantine was different. And why do we bother? Why do you bother listening to me while I'm saying this? Just look at this Holy Aedicule. Look at what Corbo assumed. Corbo assumed, for example, that this was an 8 octagon, and there was no antechamber, there was no prechamber. And we're talking about Corbo, that he was looking at the same data as Quesnel. I will disregard this entrance, for example, here, that Quesnel has an colonnaded entrance. But look at what Quesnel depicts as the Aedicule, a much smaller one with the burial chamber almost at the center of this cylindrical or polygonal side with some columns. And then he assumed that they had like a pre-chamber or at least an entrance. Okay, but who is correct? These are what we're supposed to answer with non-destructive techniques, trying to verify or invalidate certain theories. I will not go to the rest of the church because there are other scholars to do so. These are some reconstructions from Quesnel, a very talented architect, as you can see. This is the colonnaded entrance of the Anastasis, as I was saying, and they were fighting with each other, Quesnel and Corbo. The Corbo disregarded the presence of this colonnaded entrance. Guaston had the theory that the rotunda was not constructed at once, but it was constructed in two phases. So there was actually a wall surrounding the Aedicule to protect it while the rest of the rotunda was building. These are stories that architects can finish, they can debate about that. And then you have depictions like this for the general public. Very nice depiction indeed, but again, we have to realize that this is oriented mostly to the general public to have a better idea of how they look like. But I don't think we should be very skeptical about the accuracy of such kind of depictions. For example, the basilica, it looks too thick. This was supposed to be a wooden roof, most probably. We have to be careful of what the artist is trying to say and what they are trying to depict. And again, it's good for exhibitions, but I would be very careful to use them in actual scientific work. So how did the 4th century Holy Aedicule look like? Do we have any actual depictions of this Aedicule? Well, not really. In the 5th century, we have the Narbonne model, but we are not sure whether, for example, this actually depicted, whether this depicted the actual Aedicule. For start, it looks like it has, it's like a decagon. And not only that, but the burial surface is very close to the walls. So most probably it's like a semantics-based model rather than an actual representation of the tomb as it looked in the 4th century. I believe it was close to the semantics because you can see these semi-elliptical or semi-quarter spherical knees, and you are going to see it in other depictions. You can see that the columns around it, whether there were 8, 10, 12, we will never know. And there was also a kind of an entrance, as you can see here, that was covering the entrance of this, not the chamber, but the quarter spherical knees in front of the low entrance of the burial chamber. And again, should be low, but here it's depicted high. So again, we still don't have any good idea how it looked in the era of Constantine. We have some ampulla. These are like touristic products they were taking to Europe. And what we can discern here is this kind of, could be the same elliptical semi quarter sphere knees that they were trying to show. Perhaps here it's like a metal entrance in front of the Aedicule. You see the cross, and these are the very tall columns of the rotunda. Here it's again the same one. We do not know whether this represents the knees or whether this was something in front of the entrance of the Aedicule. Again, we have no idea whether this was octagonal, cylindrical, or polygonal. Again, we are already at 6th, 7th century. We have some paintings. It could look better, but not much for our taste to understand whether this was, is it a hexagonal Aedicule? Is it just showing the entrance of the Aedicule? Again, we lose important data because we do not have any depictions, actual depictions at the standards we believe today to be sure how it looked like. So, was it completely monolithic? What was the roof made of? Was it a rock? Was it a build? Was it wooden? Was it polygonal? Was it spherical and cylindrical? How many sides? Biddle, one of the scholars that have worked on this church for years. Ναι, είναι κάτι. Τι έγινε. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes,
go. We
indeed.
can
Okay,
hear.
because
well.
you said they
hear
called me
you.
that. Okay,
Please
sorry.
But
continue.
you have to go on because in less than a quarter of an hour you have to.
Yeah, I'm finishing. Beetle, for example, here assumed that there was a rock roof above the burial chamber, and then that there were more than one tombs inside the burial chamber, and that they filled that. However, that was kind of problematic because in this position we found the rock, so it could not be a built area. What we hypothesize is that if it was a single chamber, a single tomb chamber, then this was cut in this kind of way. This direction is perpendicular to the longitudinal axis of the rotunda, and they had a small entrance. Doctor, the leg will show you about, will talk about the archaeometrics of the tomb, and we will see that below the plate that we found, below the actual plate that we see today, that this dates back to the era of Constantine. I will not go into much detail about that, other than to show that although we believed for many years that during the destruction of the Persians that this was destroyed along the east-west axis, and this was replaced with a built roof. It's also problematic in the sense that we did not find today so much rock volume that could represent to a monolithic edicule back in the era of Constantine. And again, I'm not sure whether I'm giving you answers or whether I'm posing more problems, but that's science anyway to start with. Some more depictions from Vincent and Abel. You can see that they're trying to depict the same church, and they have different depictions. And you can see actually in front of the rotunda there's something like a chapel here. They are depicting an edicule which is circular and everything is aligned. These are the kind of problems. Again, we have the destruction of Al-Hakim, but was it destroyed much? If it was destroyed, why do we see like a wall on that side? Is it coinciding with Dr. Moropoulous' theory of destruction along the east-west axis? If yes, how much was destroyed if we found on the burial on the burial surface of the tomb remnants of the mortars from the Constantine era? In the Byzantine edicule, we see that there was an antechamber, pre-chamber added to the east. Again, Biddle hypothesized the polygonal western part and an eastern part with two doors. The 11th century, you can see that here Corbo is skeptical about whether this was still octagonal or whether they had a pre-chamber. Again, we have to put some logic behind of what we're depicting in order to understand what we're looking at. The Crusaders, which was a later addiction, for example, the doors disappeared. Did they actually cover this with this? Why is it so thick masonry in front of the burial chamber? At least they have depicted this in the right orientation. Here, this Armenian chapel. And again, do we know anything about the height? Not really, but we can deduct that probably later on. This is the plan of the church and the Crusaders. I will go quickly because I'm running out of time, I guess. And Professor Kores anyway explained it much more correctly for us. I will skip that also. The problem with depiction is that these are the kind of depiction we had. Here, actually, we have to be careful because this was reversed. This is the same side, but since they are printing paper, they had to put the reverse for that. Details like fluted shaft. This guy in 1487 saw that, so he put that detail into his drawing. Otherwise, they're not much useful other than is it confusing? Is it semicircular? Is it like this is wider than the actual western part? This looks even wider. So these are the difficulties we're looking at. The problem also was that they constructed many copies of the Holy Aedicule. I think nowadays there are 200 copies worldwide of the Holy Aedicule. I have seen a copy that they have made a Mykonos depiction of the Aedicule. And this is a drawing of the actual building, not the opposite. That probably looks much better in the sense that they have details how the arches look like the windows. We have to be careful with this, and we have to take into account what we're looking at in order to understand what we're trying to see. I will talk about this holy rock configuration. A small detail here, these three holes, which should be here, have disappeared during the Bonifacio modifications. But again, how much was modified? When, Dr. Deleg will explain you that we have found many materials dating from different areas. So if they, for example, they have modified the south part of the burial chamber, why do we see remnants of the Constantinian era up there? And then later on the lower levels. And again, inside the burial surface, we have found materials dating from different eras. Zulardo was a very useful drawing back in 1586. And again, some other problems. Okay, this is expected, and this is what we assume that it was the Crusaders' Edicule. But then again, details like Amico. Amico was a very talented architect. But again, you will see kind of problems with the scaling and how it looked like, and the very famous depiction of Edicula that we use today and we try to understand is this one. Yes, it was very close to what they were looking at during that time, but he has difficulty in creating this. I mean, what was the roof above the burial chamber? Is it monolithical? Was the roof even higher? I'm asking that because if we look at the later from Horn, for example, some critical things, there were two windows. There was an opening for transmitters of the Holy Light. The current two openings are here. So we could see that inside, so that would affect the rock, for example. Another question, look at the tomb here. Cornelis de Bruyne, he was very talented in making all these beautiful sketches and so on. Why did he depict this? Why is not the burial surface touching the western part? Nowadays it's not, there's no gap in between. Problems like this emerge as we find more evidence of, or at least more documentation. Here, what are they depicting? Are they depicting the same gap? I'm having difficulty understanding what they are trying to depict. Look at Horn. Horn, for example, he made all these details, he made some measurements, and then you look at the interior of the burial chamber, and it's very difficult to realize what you are looking at. Remember that Amico, he created like a roof at that height level, not up there. I believe that Horn was most probably correct, in the sense that, yes, it would be very difficult to have a big rock volume above the burial chamber. And I'm finishing with Luigi Meyer, 1801. Look how it looked like. And this was the Crusaders' Edicule. And again, this was an Edicule that we were trying to see from with various depictions. Komninos, we have seen the plans, and some more recent plans are from Tucci and Bonora, the 3D survey of the Holy Sepulchre Church from 2007. The previous one was Balodimos and Lavas Balodimos that Professor Georgopoulos talked about today. Some other plans from Vincent and Abel of the church, and again, I'm concentrating on the Holy Aedicule, and I'm finishing in about 4 or 5 minutes, don't worry about it. This is National Geographic. I will skip all these things because these are more artistic rather than scientific. And coming to today, again, these are the main, this is the chapel, this is the Edicule we see today, the chapel of the angel with the dome above it, the tomb chamber and the burial surface, and then you have the mere bearers wall painting. I think Dr. Deleg will talk about this more, and then you have the onion dome above it. So the problem is, how do we see in the interior of the structure? I will not go through this procedure, but it's not an easy process. We have to understand the structure, what we were trying before, make an acquisition setup, and we decided to do a two-dimensional scan by scan so that through a whole methodological approach, we could get some results. And results are like this. These are ground penetrating radar prospections from the outside surfaces of the monument, looking inside, and at every height level we're taking these scans, we were put in position and we try to realize how the internal layer was like. For example, here we realize that this was a remnant of the monolithic Edicule. We are calling it Holy Rock. And this is a big block on the north side of the burial chamber. and there is an even bigger block at the south area of the burial chamber. This is the Holy Tomb. The rest is built masonry. So, as Professor Moropoulou explained, we created polylines. We gave that through the ground penetrating radar, and they created a 3D representation of the Holy Rock. I'm trying to depict this here. This is an overlay. I think Professor Kores saw that yesterday. This is Amiko's depiction here, overlaid over the current plan of the Edicule and the remnants of the Holy Rock. So you see that these things fit together, but these were taken into account. The beauty of this was that Professor Kores was making this overlay independent of our research team. We were doing the GPR scans. So they coincided and they gave the same representations. It would be very unfortunate if this was smaller and this was bigger, because that would not coincide. And to finish up, just to give you an idea what we have a better, what we think it looked like before the whole evolution. These are the remnants of the original Edicule, the Holy Rock as we call it. It's about 2 meters high, and you saw the configuration. It's this one, it's two big blocks on the north and the south side of the burial chamber on the tomb. Most probably the Crusaders' Edicule reached up to this height, and this is not arbitrary in the sense that obviously it corresponds well to the roof of what Amico depicted, but not only that, but this is at the center height of the mere bearers cylindrical area, and there is a structural crack there. So it's not by coincidence. And then Komnenos built a much higher Edicule. So he actually put a dome above the previous height of the western part of the Edicule, and another dome above the pre-chamber, above the Chapel of the Angel. And to finish up, this is a 3D model, a 3D section of a model that Dr. PhD candidate Manolis Alexakis did with photogrammetry. And this is actually the structural crack I was talking about. So this was probably the height level of the Byzantine Crusaders Edicule, and so it's not by pure coincidence that we have structural cracks at this level, and we have potential remnants of the chapel of the Angels rooftop from the 16th century. So the Komnenos effectively added above the previous height level of the Edicule, and he changed a lot about the internal decorations and the plating, but he kept much of the burial surface intact. And to finish up, you have to not only look at the Holy Aedicule, but you have to look at the whole picture. These are depictions of the geometric surveys of the underground cisterns, and these are from Corbo. It's a big cistern, almost 11 meters down earth. So you have to realize that this was not an easy task to find out how it looked like the era of Jesus Christ. I think I'm running out of time. Just to finish up is that to give an answer of why the temple was not shifted further to the west, and we were lucky that they did not destroy the tomb of Christ. I think we believe that most probably it had to do with the configuration of the western front of the quarry, and eventually probably it was much higher than what we thought, and the Hadrian architects actually just stopped there. So we were lucky and unlucky in the sense that, yes, they covered the tomb, they protected it for centuries until Constantine came and he revealed the whole area. Thank you very much, and sorry for the delay, but we started a little bit late.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lampropoulos. You presented very clearly the hypothesis that arise concerning the evolution of the structure and the architecture of the Holy Aedicule based on our non-destructive prospections, and our, I would say, materials investigation. It is an investigation which permitted us to go through history and through archaeology as well, and explain, interpret our technical data through the various historic interpretations, using, of course, historic evidence as was presented in bibliography. This is, in a few words, to say that it is really an interdisciplinary work, and I congratulate Kyriakos because he learned the language of other disciplines through this. Thank you very much, Kyriakos.
Thank you, thank you.
Is there any basic question before passing to the other lecturer, Dr. Caterina Delengou? No.